Welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Nakma. Joining me is Professor Harsh Pant. Let me give you a quick idea of what all can you expect from this episode of the Ideas Factory. Afghanistan, of course, and the violence, escalating violence there is top of the mind still, and we've seen that it dominated the Shanghai Cooperation Organization talks too. Other than that, India has done some plain talking with China, so we will discuss that as well. So these are a couple of issues around which we will discuss. Analyze. Professor Harsh Pant will analyze what does it actually mean. Very warm welcome to you, Harsh.
Thank you, Nagma.
So we saw that the SEO was primarily dominated by Afghanistan and the escalating violence there. The violence continues to increase, and there have been attacks on civilians, on journalists, on Indian journalists too. Uh, there has been a lot of concern, and while all this is going on, as the Taliban is making rapid advances, we saw that Afghanistan dominated SCO, and there has been a reiteration of actually India's stand that there can be no other alternative but political dialogue and peace talk, which is Afghan led. While all this is happening, S. Jaishankar also said very clearly that Afghanistan's future cannot be its past. But the foreign minister, Afghan foreign minister, pointed out that there has been a collusion with foreign fighters and regional and international terrorist network. Uh, what does he really imply here, and how do you see the situation here in spite of all the member countries coming together and saying that we will cooperate in building a stable Afghanistan?
Yeah, Nagma, a couple of points. One on this issue of Afghanistan, where we are on the ground, we are seeing not only rapid advances by Taliban, but also a return back to their old form in the sense of the kind of strictures they are passing, the kind of commands they are giving to local commanders, the kind of strictures on women and girls, and how should everyone be behaving. All of those concerns that were always there in the minds of those who were worried about Taliban's advances. And I think what is happening on the ground is certainly worrying. Additionally, what is worrying is what I think the Afghan government is saying is that there is collusion and open threats by Pakistani officials saying that Pakistani military might be involved if certain kinds of if Afghan government decides to dislodge Taliban fighters from certain positions. I think that is again very, very worrying because at least the argument was that if nothing else, Pakistan would now be willing to work with countries, maybe not India, but countries like China and Russia, to make it clear that instability in the region will not be allowed, and the Taliban, if at all have to govern, they will have to govern within certain parameters. But if you have a country that is now saying openly that we will fight with the Taliban and prevent certain other stakeholders, in fact, prevent the legitimate government, at least till now, of Kabul in managing their own domestic security issues, then that certainly portends a very difficult scenario ahead. And that I think that being said, the SCO gave out a very strong message, and the message was very clear. The message was unambiguous that from the regional perspective, as regional countries look at this through a different set of lens post American withdrawal, as they are certainly increasingly worried about the negative externalities emanating from Afghanistan, they have a they are unified in their concern and they are unified in what they want to achieve. What is problematic is that how they will be able to operationalize some of these ideas. So while the idea that Afghanistan's future will have to be dependent on various stakeholders coming together, sorting it out through peaceful negotiations, force cannot be an answer to what is happening in Afghanistan and for achieving political objectives. And on this, we saw a strong unity among countries as disparate as India, China, Russia, Central Asian countries. But the problem remains fundamentally: what are these countries now willing to do if Taliban continues with its advances and if Taliban continues to make it plain to the world that they are going to govern through a very medieval mindset that they had projected in the 1990s. So I think that's the concern. SCO has made an important intervention, but whether that intervention is enough remains to be seen.
And that's the big question whether that intervention will have any impact. I mean, China, you rightly pointed out that countries as diverse as China, India, Pakistan, I mean, all these countries are member states of the SCO, have actually agreed that there should be peace and stability. But how will this actually operationalize? But on the sidelines of the SCO, Foreign Minister Jaishankar also met the Chinese counterpart, and it was actually the two had met, just post the Galvan clash in 2020, in September 2020 in Moscow. Now, here, this meeting in Dushanbe, and we saw that S. Jaishankar very clearly stated that any unilateral change in the status quo is not acceptable. Where China has also kind of agreed that they are ready to work on issues. But what is the difference from Moscow to Dushanbe? Do you see, at the same time, there have been new camps, Chinese camps that have been spotted along the LAC, around the LAC. So, how easy it is now to trust China, and has something changed from Moscow to Dushanbe?
Well, my own assessment is that the trust deficit is only widened from Moscow to Dushanbe, because clearly in Moscow a certain set of parameters were laid out. Those parameters are not being followed by the Chinese side. So I think what Jai Shankar said in his intervention, or in his talks, at least what is reported, is that it's very clear that unless the past agreements are adhered to, unless those past parameters are followed, it will be very difficult to move forward, because clearly there has been very little engagement forward. We have seen the earlier this year in February, the limited agreement around Pangong So that saw disengagement happening. But beyond that, because the idea was that it would lead to more talks, it would lead to more steps on the ground, it would lead to greater disengagement and de-escalation, which means that the forces that are being mobilized will be demobilized. Instead, what we are seeing is a growing mobilization from both sides. And of course, Chinese are mobilizing, and India has to respond in some ways to make sure that last year's repeat does not happen. So we are looking at at a build-up of a crisis in along the border, and it's amassing such huge number of troops along a very, very sensitive border is not really most conducive to bilateral engagement. But that's exactly what is happening. And I think the structure of the negotiations is still very, very diverse. So India wants that border issue should be front and center, that unless there is movement on the border issue, we can't really look at the normalization of the bilateral relationship. Chinese, for whatever reasons, do not see that the problem that their actions have created for Indian government as far as Indian public opinion is concerned. And they continue to insist that, as if nothing has happened, that border issue can be segregated from the larger bilateral relationship, that the bilateral relationship should continue to move forward. We should continue to work on other issues which they claim are very important. I don't know how they can see that, how they can assess that other issues will be more important for any Indian government unless the border issue is resolved. But they continue to insist that border can be segregated, border can be managed on the sidelines, and bilateral relationship should not be held hostage to it. I mean, one of the subtle shifts that we noticed this time was the Chinese foreign minister saying we are not rivals, we are partners. But that doesn't really mean anything in concrete terms unless there are some positive developments on the ground. And China's almost a kind of in transitions that we are witnessing on the border issue is making it very difficult for India to take any steps, any positive steps. So all the steps that have been taken, of course, India is signaling in some ways that we are not happy. We want some movement from China, but China continues to insist on a different paradigm. And unless those paradigms come together, there can't be any positive engagement. So from Moscow to Dushanbe, we are not really looking at a substantive evolution. Instead, we are looking to hardening of positions, both in terms of negotiations as well as in terms of what is happening on the ground. Both forces are being mobilized. Chinese permanent structures are being constructed. Rapid development of border infrastructure on Indian side, border construction of structures on the Chinese side, and bringing in more and more amassing of more and more troops on both sides. That can really spiral out of control if the two diplomats are actually not able to send out a message that needs to be controlled. And I'm afraid Chinese side are not willing to budge on a basic fundamental reality that last year was an inflection point. What happened in Galwan was an inflection point, that no Indian government can move forward unless Chinese side really makes a show or demonstrate their intent that they are really serious about the border issue. And Chinese side have given no such inclination, I'm afraid.
So when the foreign minister, Beijing's foreign minister, makes a statement saying that it is ready to seek a mutually acceptable solution, what does he really mean? A mutually acceptable solution, though we know that this engagement process has actually reached a stalemate and not much progress has happened, and the friction points like Gogra and Hot Spring and Depsang, they all remain very tense in eastern Ladakh. But this statement, does it signal any hope?
Well, I think it signals hope to an extent that there is certainly a realization, I think, on both sides that conflict is something that should be avoided at any costs. And mutually acceptable solution means, in diplomatic balance, that we want a solution that can actually prevent this from escalating. So both sides don't want an escalation. Both sides don't want a conflict. Both sides don't want their armies to engage with each other face to face. And I think that means that certain level of disengagement and de-escalation should be there. The challenge, of course, is that what is the Chinese side willing to do about it? And so long as China is not willing to do anything explicitly and demonstrate to India that it is serious about the crisis on the border, I'm afraid the larger bilateral relationship, which, by the way, both sides agreed is facing a negative spiral, is on a downward trajectory. We cannot prevent that, we cannot contain that downward trend unless we see some movement from Beijing. I think what is also happening is that China does feel under pressure on a number of fronts. So while having almost 60-70,000 troops along its border with India, it's a huge deal given that China is facing challenge or at least is being so aggressive on the Taiwanese Straits, in South China Sea, East China Sea. There are multiple pressure points on China itself, and that is something the Chinese are worried about. But in an ideal world, they should be doing more to engage India so that at least some pressure is contained here and along the border. But that doesn't seem to be happening. I think this idea that they have to save face somehow, and they really cannot move back without a safe face-saving measure, is something that perhaps will take us, will be one of the instrumentalities available for the diplomats. But I think the fact that we are also not, clear in terms of the next round of talks, border talks, is also very serious. There have been reports that the Chinese side have not really given us a date, a final date for the next round of military talks. So if that is not happening, then that is also serious. I hope that gets resolved soon, and we actually start the process of negotiations, because on the ground, tactical and operational talks are extremely important if a repeat of the last years to be prevented.
Certainly, like you pointed out, that India has given out a clear message. India has given out this message to China at a couple of platforms. Also in Uzbekistan, Harsh, foreign minister has very clearly stated that as far as connectivity is concerned, it's a matter of trust, and Jaishankar has given out that message to Pakistan as well, because Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan has been complaining that unless the Kashmir issue is resolved, the trade and commerce and other economic relations are suffering. But he's very clearly stated it is not a one-way street. But taking a big dig at China's BRI, Foreign Minister has very clearly stated that connectivity is an act of trust, and it should not promote. It should promote economic activities, and it should not create debt burdens, which what exactly BRI has done. I mean, look at all the countries around. So clear message there too.
Yes, on connectivity, I think very, very important message, because that conference was very important. It was looking at South Asia, Central Asia connectivity issues, and in the context of Afghanistan, that has become a really important priority. And I think, as India pointed out, as Indian Foreign Minister pointed out, India has been trying to help Afghanistan uh, connect to the wider world without actually being dependent on any particular country, which has been the bane of Afghan politics and Afghan foreign policy, that they have to be so dependent on Pakistan that they could not really wean themselves away from it. But India, through Chabahar, for example, in particular, has been trying to give an alternative connectivity view of Afghanistan to the world, and that has been, something that India was projecting as an alternative to the BRI type of projects, which are top down, often not financially sustainable, and often not environmentally sustainable, but also that violate that fundamental norm in interstate relations of sovereignty. That unless you respect the sovereign values of the other state, of your neighbors, of your partners, the whole idea of connectivity becomes very, very problematic and will not generate the kind of positive outcomes that I think all those who are engaged in connectivity projects want. So I think that's the challenge for the world, that's the challenge for BRI, and that's the challenge for the alternatives to BRI that are emerging. And India has been at the front and center of arguing about it, of making a case that, look, from the very beginning, India was the only country initially that started talking about these issues of financial, environmental sustainability, of debt traps, of the fact that some of these projects are not really building capacity of the states concerned, and they are largely being driven by Chinese geopolitical agenda. And now most of these concerns are vividly expressed by other countries, by major Western countries, by countries some of whom are facing or getting Chinese largesse on connectivity. So I think India's point has been validated, and therefore India forcefully could make this point in this summit, which was very important summit in its own right, looking at a very narrow geography of the larger politics of connectivity, which is simply what happens to South Asia and Central Asian connectivity, which is a very important part of the engagement at this particular point in time. And given that Central Asian countries and South Asian countries and the larger Eurasian landmass is so tied up in terms of its economic future, it's very important that this knot gets untied. And so India's message was that unless certain kinds of normative values are followed, connectivity projects will only be seen as an extension of geopolitical agenda rather than as something that can enhance the capacities of countries that really want to enhance their economic and cultural connectivities to other parts of the world.
True. Connectivity should not be an extension of the geopolitical agenda. India has made that very clear. And very interestingly, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi made it very clear to the world by tweeting about his wishes to Dalai Lama on his 86th birthday. I mean, he wished him last year as well, but it wasn't made public. So that was again a strong message at a time when the India-China relation is at a low ebb, and the Prime Minister making it very clear uh, that he's wishing the Dalai Lama at the cost of upsetting China. China clearly gets very upset at all this. That was again a very clear message, and it's different from last year that he made it very public.
Yes, I thought. I mean, I think everyone thought that this was something that was interesting, at least, because India had been coy about the Tibet issue and the way it deals with Dalai Lama and the way it deals with the larger Tibetan issue, because there are challenges in more ways than one about how to engage with on this issue with China. But now that that China has almost in India-China relations have come to a point where almost every single assumption of Sino-Indian relations are being appended or are being relooked at. I think one can easily look at um, you know this attempt to bring in the issue of Tibet relatively subtly by the Prime Minister to make a case, to signal to Beijing that, look, there are limits to India's attempt in managing very, very contentious topics with China, and so long as there is no reciprocity in Chinese behavior, India has the potential to bring in contentious issues like Tibet and Taiwan back into the reckoning. Let's not assume that they are sorted from India's side. India will contest. India will make sure that these issues remain alive. India also has the potential to be slightly more disruptive to China if China wants. If China continues with its disruptive policies vis-a-vis India, because a large part of this one China approach that India has followed is that it would allow for a larger normalization of relationship. It would allow for a larger normal settlement of the border dispute and other disputes that are there. But if you see how China is violating every single issue that is on the agenda, every single agreement that India has signed with China, how China is challenging the status quo unilaterally, I think India also can be forgiven for responding in kind. And I think that's what Prime Minister was hinting at, that this is something that can be done, and that will have costs for China. Of course, it will also have costs for India. But I think that the argument is that life can be made difficult for Beijing. Now, if that is the route that China wants to go in for, then I think they are more than welcome to, because I think we are not looking at any conciliatory measures from Chinese side, and India therefore is now bringing in one by one some of these issues that had largely been put on the back burner. And I think the message to Dalai Lama therefore was interesting, both and contained a lot of messages, both spiritually as well as geopolitically.
Absolutely. Just enough time we have for a couple of questions from our audience. There is concern about the situation in Afghanistan and India's investment there, all that India has done in Afghanistan for the development of the country. So Akshay Pandit has a question that what is the future of the Chabahar port?
Well, that's a question that has often been at the forefront of Indian foreign policy priorities, because Chabahar port itself has gone through various transitions, and this and the foundations have been sometimes looked at very very strong, but other times they have been very relatively wobbly. But it all depends now on the new dispensation that is coming to power in Tehran, and I think their engagement with America. So India, for its part, has done what it is supposed to do as far as Chabahar is concerned. We have the first phase of Chabahar was inaugurated 3 years back, and since then, India has been at the forefront of making sure that Chabahar remains operational, that Chabahar continues to work as per the priorities, not of India, but the priorities of what countries like Afghanistan and Iran want. After all, this is an Iranian project.
Yes.
But the issue is that because of American sanctions, Chabahar port has not really taken off, because Iran is not really part of the global commercial supply chains. Iran is not part of, is not really engaged with wider international community on economics and commerce. And so long as that does not happen, I think a port like Chabahar will perform below its potential. And so there is certainly some degree of angst in Tehran that it is not working as perhaps the Iranians had expected. But I think a large part of that issue can only be resolved if Tehran comes to some sort of an agreement with the US and with the Western countries, and so becomes a part of the global economic supply chains and global economic networks, which would allow Chabahar to actually take off and work more productively as the fulcrum of enhancing economic engagement and economic vitality in a part of the world, frankly, that has not seen economic vitality for a long time.
Absolutely, and the increased violence and escalation in Afghanistan is a concern for the entire region, with the new dispensation in Iran, and whatever happens in Afghanistan will actually determine what would be the future of all the development projects in the region. So that's a concern, but that's all we have time for this week. Thank you so much for answering that question, Harsh, and thank you all for watching the Ideas Factory. Do send in your questions. We will try to take some more questions next week.